Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, Christ and Country in Our Politics. My name is Austin Tiffany. I'm a Senior Director at Good Faith Partnership, and it's been an honor and a privilege of ours to host some discussions around this topic over the last couple of weeks. We have a really exciting discussion here for us today, so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our chair, Bishop Philip. Bishop Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Austin. Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to join us for this this webinar tonight, looking at this very hot button issue, Christ and country in our politics. And frankly, who'd have thought a couple of years ago that we would be discussing this at all? How rapidly things can change. Just very briefly for myself, my main area of engagement in public life in recent years has been with international religious freedom and indeed its denial globally. Although I was a signatory to a recent letter following the Unite the Kingdom march. But both of those issues, I think, both domestically and internationally, touch on deep questions of identity, and deep questions of identity, I think, that we can't ignore. But I think this question, and just introduce it briefly, does raise a number of questions. And is this just about identity politics in another form, or does it touch on something deeper? How perhaps might it connect with the whole quiet revival phenomenon? Of course, identity really does matter, as I suggested just now. What does it mean for Christians to say that we find our identity primarily in Christ? What does that say to our identity as citizens? Do we define our identity over and against others, or is that not relevant? I was just reflecting as I was walking the dog earlier that Jesus both said, "Whoever is not for me is against me," which is a rather exclusive claim, and he also said, "Whoever is not who's not against me is for me," which is a rather inclusive claim. And this issue of symbols, of course, is a really significant and important one. And there are all sorts of symbols which define our identity. I'm wearing one now, as I always do, around my neck. So why do we feel differently about a St. George's flag hanging from a lamppost than we do from one hanging from a village church tower? Can one image speak to different senses of identity according to context? I suspect they probably can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Danny Kruger MP. We've had to slightly juggle the order in which we're going to take our speakers tonight, because Danny is a sitting member of Parliament, and as such he needs to be in the lobbies to vote. So I'm not going to introduce you, Danny. I think you're well known. Your major claim to fame, I think, is probably giving a speech to the smallest number of MPs in Parliament and the single largest number of people online back in July. So congratulations on that, and let me hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Philip, and that's a nice claim to fame. You're right, that probably is the case. So yeah, I am voting in a moment, so I will rush away and then return. So forgive me, but I hope I'll be able to talk for a little bit before the bell goes. I'll just say a word about the speech that Bishop mentioned, in case people don't know what he's talking about, and try and explain a bit about the context for that. And then I'll say a word about my take on Christ and country, Christian nationalism. So the speech was at the end of the summer term of Parliament, and at the end of the day's debate, when the House is basically empty. And I got permission from the Speaker to make a speech about the place of the Church of England. I didn't really talk about the Church of England much. It was an excuse to make a speech about Christianity. And but I did start with the observation that the institution that I'm in, that I was speaking from, is a Christian foundation. I mean, it's literally a chapel. The House of Commons took over the St. Stephen's Chapel of the Royal Palace of Westminster in the Tudor period, and the iconography of the place, as well as much of the sort of formalities of it, including the prayers that we started at the beginning of the day, the place of the speaker's chaplain who initiates the day's business, I clearly speak to the roots of the place. And the same goes for all of our national institutions, the monarchy itself. And I argued that uniquely among the nations of the world, England was the first genuinely Christian nation in the sense of being founded as a Christian state. I mean, other nations were Christian before us, Ethiopia and Armenia and so on, but the institutions of England, out of which the UK grew, were conceived of and instituted as Christian things by the Saxons, by the kings of Wessex. So that's my romantic appeal to our nation's past. But I also argued that, and the reason I gave the speech, and I guess the reason why it did so well online, is that I was speaking into a receptive culture, into a cultural moment that wanted to hear something like this. And I say wanted to, it's not that it did well because it was controversial. And it excited lots of sort of online controversy. On the contrary, it just was widely shared by people saying this is interesting, and that they agree. And it hasn't stimulated backlash. It just sort of went well, and I'm very pleased about that. And I think it's because I was, as a good politician should, follow, not lead. Being sarcastic, we should try and lead, but I was preaching to the choir, and something is clearly up in our culture. And my general observation, and the reason why I think a message like this is so timely, is that all politics is religious. All political ideas proceed from a metaphysics, some sense, quite abstract sense of how the world is ordered, how right and wrong are constituted, and the business of politics is the business of the management of our common life, and that is properly the subject of religious attention in all cultures and in all times. And we have just as religious a politics now as we did when we were a much more overtly Christian country. The politics is a bit different. It's just as metaphysical. It's full of ethereal beliefs in abstract values. And my belief is that we are putting our faith in abstract values like human rights and individual liberty, having forgotten the roots and the source of these concepts. And as a result, we're in some trouble. We're in sort of psychic disarray because we're worshipping concepts that have we're having forgotten their true meaning and their true source. We are also, worryingly, I think, increasingly worshipping false religions. And some of them are very respectable, or could certainly have very respectable followers, world religions. And this new religion, which we haven't yet got a proper word for, and I don't like the word woke because it trivializes and disparages what is actually quite a powerful set of ideas. But sort of transgressive secularism or advanced humanism or something, whatever we call it, you kind of know what it is. That has a very strong religious quality. So I wish we would recover our real religion, the real religion on which this country was founded. A, because I think it's true and it makes for human happiness, but also because even if you don't believe in it, it's the best possible context for religious pluralism, which is also totally necessary. And as Jonathan Sacks always said, Anglican establishment, the Christian orientation of our state was an umbrella under which all other religions can helpfully shelter and be protected. And I don't think you can say that of most other religions. So that's the context of my speech. I'll say a quick word, and I see the bell is going, so I'm going to have to run in a moment, about Christian nationalism, and maybe we'll come back to this when I return if anyone wants to ask questions. But my general point is, I am a Christian and I'm a nationalist in the sense that I believe in nations, and I particularly believe in our nation for reasons I've been explaining. And I think that the God we worship is a God of nations. He's interested in nations, and the Hebrew people, the nation of Israel, are the template out of which all nations, from which all nations derive, particularly ours. And although it is true that some unsavory characters are saying some similar things, that isn't a reason to not say them. In fact, it's almost even more of a reason to say them, to show that these are actually acceptable and respectable principles, not allowed to be captured by others. But I do recognise the concern that our faith and our church and our Christian symbols might be hijacked by people who have bad faith actors. And we should be on our guard for that. But I regret it if that is the church's primary response to what is going on in our culture. I think we should be. I'm more concerned about the things that the people on those marches are concerned about, which is the growth of Islam and the growth of this aggressive anti-Christian secularism. So I am less bothered by what we call Christian nationalism than many Christians seem to be, or leading Christians. And I think we should be embracing this revival that is happening, and the fact that lots of young men are coming to church is a very encouraging development, not one to be to clutch our pearls over. And with that, Bishop, I'm going to go and vote, and I shall return in a few minutes. Okay.
We look forward to seeing you again, Danny. Thank you very much. Thank you. So thanks to Danny. I did have a couple of questions lined up to ask him, but I'm not going to ask him them now. We'll save them for later. So I'm going to hand over to John. I didn't take time to introduce Danny because his time was tight, but I will introduce John to you. John is a former MP who represented Dagenham and then Dagenham and Rainham for Labour between 2001 and 2024. He holds a PhD from the University of Warwick and formerly worked in Labour's policy unit and in Downing Street under Tony Blair. As Labour's policy coordinator under Ed Miliband, he helped shape the party's intellectual direction. His recent book, The Dignity of Labour, argues for renewing the moral foundations of political life, and he sits as an honorary fellow of Nuffield College in the University of Oxford. I trust all that is true, John, and you can confirm that?
It is, yeah. Thank you very much. Indeed, and I too welcome this initiative to discuss religion and the state of country, but I come from a slightly different perspective than Danny. I'll just make some basic introductory points. First, I think you mentioned in your introduction, there does appear to be a religious turn occurring in the country, particularly among younger generations, with church attendance and belief in God rising. You referenced the Quiet Revival, the Bible Society's report, I think it was from April last year, which talked about a dramatic growth in church attendance by as much as 50% between 2018 and 2024, most significantly between those 18 to 24-year-olds. Plus a wider, actually, embrace of God and more positive attitudes to faith and renewed spirituality amongst younger generations. And indeed, in my old East London seat, over the last few years, we saw a palpable uplift in religious participation, all to the good. Obviously, for balance, you could acknowledge, for example, British Social Attitude Survey, which points the other way in terms of church attendance. But if you accept we are experiencing a religious turn, then we might speculate on why, because you could say it suggests a search for meaning and purpose in the modern world, in a world disfigured by uncertainty, a sense of generational rupture, where religion maybe offers a sense of community, identity, stability in a world turned upside down, and one where invasive technology has actually challenged the integrity of the human being itself. So I think we can accept that sense of a religious turn. And the second point is, I'd say we've retreated quite quickly from an era you could describe as sort of muscular or even evangelical secularism. And many won't remember, but 20 years ago, the new atheism of writers such as Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, Hitchens asserted a new age of reason, of disinterested scientism, the triumph of a sort of form of liberal rationality.
Yeah.
And this sort of form of atheism was in part a reaction to the religious fundamentalism of 9/11, but it was also a sort of wider hubristic belief in a form of liberal democracy built around market economics, which I would argue today is sort of running on empty. And in contrast, today you do see religious convictions appearing almost culturally ascendant, high-profile public conversions, figures like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was one of the new atheists, Jordan Peterson, various soccer players, rock stars, very dodgy comedians. There's a whole sort of list of them you can see. And again, you've got to ask why. Maybe the effects of pandemic, when we were literally forced to confront death and reconsider maybe life's purpose. Many point to immigration and cultural tensions. Maybe a decline in our ideological traditions, political alienation, institutional distrust, social anxiety. Again, the threats from technological change, maybe a reaction to patterns of war and conflict. My third point is stretching into sort of more contentious territory, however, in the way that today's religions are being mobilized politically around questions of identity through various ethno-nationalist movements that seek to divide, a form of populism which is premised on the friend-enemy fault line that upends a sense of the commons. You can see it in the far right, adopting Christian nationalist imagery, flags, crosses and the like. On the recent Tommy Robinson march, you can see it in forms of sort of muscular Catholicism. Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance, Victor Orban. It's not exclusively Christian nationalist, though, I'd add. Following what happened in Gaza, you saw it spill into the ballot box last year with the election of independent Muslim MPs, which possibly foreshadows the emergence of a distinct UK political movement over the coming years. You see it in a more animated Hindu nationalist politics in places like Harrow or Leicester. So you see these new movements around the defence of a notion of the sacred, arguably emerging as a new political front line. And my fourth point would simply to suggest that we need an honest discussion of what comes with this. A new language of racial superiority, geographical separation, a drumbeat of forced migration, even for settled citizens, of impending civil war, a language presented through exclusivist forms of ethno-nationalism. In contrast to what Danny said, we've recently seen flags used as signifiers of racial purity and exclusion, intimately linked to preserving a certain religious heritage. I don't think we can underestimate the significance of this moment. The traditional notion of politics, indeed the ancient definition of what politics is, was built around competing notions of how we organise society, anchored around alternative models of justice. And today, we see politics increasingly being reset around competing visions of what is sacred rather than what is considered just. Again, why is this happening? Now, for many, and this is the nuts of this, if you want, it's about the consequences of mass immigration. Now, I think that's a bit too simplistic. Now, I would say that, in terms of full disclosure, I come from an Irish immigrant working class family. And for me, this argument is sort of politically functional for many, but you have to go much deeper. And so my next point would be to suggest that this political appropriation of religion is intimately linked to almost the sense of an ending, specifically an economic revolution that was forged in the late 70s. If you want, sort of Thatcherism embraced a global market while deindustrializing at home. It promised a form of liberal democracy forged on inclusive growth, sound money, social mobility, the end of class politics. It sort of stood for a form of cultural and social reconciliation, the delivery of political stability. Arguably today it delivers none of these. Economically, we're consumed by enduring cost of living, housing crises, wages and productivity flatlined since the economic crisis. Economic democracy has sort of ushered in oligarchy, crushing inequalities, intergenerational rupture, social mobility's rewinding, our public realm arguably lies in decay. Socially, we're drowning in culture wars that threaten post-war advances in civil rights, erect canyons of age, education, class, geography that sort of demarcate the country. Politically, we're being upended, and our political parties are ill-equipped to deal with this sense of upheaval, an upheaval powered by sort of modern technologies that atrophy our culture, a culture sort of reduced to little more than technologically powered forms of data exchange. To me, it signals that the Thatcher revolution is over, but what is the political alternative? It's certainly not being provided by mainstream parties that advance this form of liberal democracy, and in turn they're casualties, and because they've drained trust from mainstream politics. As you mentioned, for years I was the MP for Dagenham, and we were sort of upstream of Farage, Trump, Brexit. But we were the front line in a battle with the far right as a sort of canary down the mine shaft. In Dagenham, it was powered by populist forces, a sense of an escalating crisis, a growing distance between the lives my constituents were promised by this form of social democracy, liberal democracy, and the lives they were forced to live. And that translates into feelings of rage, anger, often born by a sense of frustration, shame even, failure, humiliation. Fast forward to today, and I'd suggest the same forces are driving modern populism and literally upending the liberal democracies that promise so much more, but increasingly, if you want, deliver so little. And to confront that requires a very different public conversation, one sort of built around what lives people wish to live, how we live together, our obligations to one another, and what gives us individual and collective purpose. And I would argue without such a reckoning with forms of religious extremism, this will endanger our democracy, bringing violence and social upheaval. So I'll suggest what we're seeing now is the early skirmishes in a very different type of politics, but driven by a sense of an ending, which is sort of detonating traditional liberal politics. So what's to be done? Just a couple of points. I would suggest it requires a new national vision and spiritual rearmament in the country, actually, to sort of challenge a sort of soullessness to our political life, move beyond consumerism, individualism, utility as the basis of achievement. Traditional secular humanist notions of material and procedural justice will not suffice. But I would also say that includes challenging the way the idea of Jesus is being appropriated by the far right and white nationalism, and instead reinsert one built around less about racial superiority and expulsion, instead about love and support for the poor, one best expressed in the parable of the Good Samaritan who crosses the road to help the other, the person of a different skin colour and nationality. My point is the need to reassert a revived humanism, actually, and reject the use of religion as a prop for an exclusivist, civilizational project that bends towards white supremacy. Second task is to build a pluralism of the like that Danny talked about, which begs the question whether traditional multiculturalism will suffice. That those traditional approaches based on recognition tend to fall short of measures to help forge a common life, the duties and responsibilities of modern citizenship, if you want. And I know there are intercultural experiments within the Anglican community in places like Leicester and Bradford, and we should have a look at them. Thirdly, I'd say such an approach involves honesty within various denominations regarding extremism and the creation of new forms of leadership to challenge this internally, both theologically and organisationally. Fourth, I'd say we need to reassess traditional approaches to interfaith dialogues, whether they will suffice, and consider new forms of community organising to challenge modern extremism. And finally, you cannot dodge it, the question of political leadership in this moment to help forge a different approach to modern citizenship. And this is sort of painful for me. I'm from the left. Our sort of utilitarian focus on growth often involves the suspension of the ethical, actually, within the public domain. And within the government, there is a limited capacity for engagement around faith in the public realm. Keir Starmer is arguably the first openly atheist prime minister in British history. And what's going on today requires a political understanding and leadership, both to revise a sense of the national mission, but also in the curation of new approaches to community cohesion and integration. So I think the government should get a grip of this, because this is arguably the outstanding issue of our time. It was intimated, actually, in his recent speech to the Labour Party conference, but I question the follow-up since then. Of course, these 5 suggestions will not suffice, not least because we require a new economic model and a new constitutional settlement. Those sorts of questions for another day, I suppose. But I do believe discussions such as this might help us reassess what's going on in the country and literally how we might live together going forward. So there's just sort of a few introductory comments.
Really helpful, John. Thank you. And Danny, good to have you back with us. I want to put to both of you two sides of a coin, if I may, or one side of a piece. I mean, it seems to me that there is good theological rationale both for globalism and localism. Globalism because, as Christians, we proclaim that Jesus is Lord. That was a revolutionary micro creed, because it essentially declared that Jesus was Lord and that Caesar was not. So it was it was in that sense a global political claim. And yet there's localism, it seems to me, is hardwired into the Christian story, because Jesus was born in a specific place and a specific time. So the incarnation requires us to take the specific and the local seriously. So my two-sided question is to you, Danny. What do you think a healthy Christian internationalism looks like? And to you, John, and you've given us a lot already, but what does a healthy Christian nationalism look like? Can we start with you, Danny?
Thank you. I'm really sorry I couldn't get much of what John was saying, because the bits I caught were really interesting, and I regret not being able to respond properly. Well, thank you. I think if you're asking me what does, in a sort of political policy terms, what does Christian internationalism look like? I mean,
yes, I think I am. I mean, I can articulate that for what it means to church.
I mean,
yes,
it can look like all sorts of things. I mean, there was the concept of Christendom, the International Fellowship of Christian Countries, out of which the EU derived in part. I mean, the EU has different sources, some of them unsavoury, but one of them being Christian democracy, and the sense that there was a shared culture among the nations of Europe that could be reflected in some institutional arrangements. So membership of international communities, treaties between states, all of that is, I think, very compatible with Christianity. But fundamentally, my view is that, you're right to reference the specific and the local in the gospel. I mean, I would go further, as I said earlier, in saying that the God, particularly the God of the Old Testament, out of which which Jesus acknowledged, never said anything other than that he was a Jew and the heir to the teachings of the Old Testament. But the God of the Bible is a God of nations, and I think there is something essential about that in our politics. And so the internationalism that I think obviously we should all belong to, in this nation particularly, has been an internationalist one, a globalist one, since the earliest times, a trading nation, and one intimately interconnected with the continent in particular. I mean, in my constituency, there are bones found from people who'd walked here from the Alps in an era when there was no English Channel. So we're only recently in Ireland, but the nation is meaningful. But can I just I think it's relevant to your question, Bishop, but I want to go back to your opening remarks, because I've just looked up the phrase you mentioned. You said that Jesus said both, that whoever is not for me is against me, and whoever is not against me is for me. With respect, I think you're presenting a false equivalence to those two phrases, and it's very important to understand the context of them both. I mean, in the first one, when he said whoever is not for me is against me, he was making a truth claim about what we now call Christianity, about belief in him being the only way. And if you don't believe in him, you are outside, the covenant.
Yep.
And then when he said, "Whoever is not against us is for us," he was talking in the context of his disciples having pointed out that people were casting out demons, performing miracles in his name. So followers of Jesus, but they did not accompany us. So, and he said, that's fine. Whoever is not against us is for us. If anyone gives you even a cup of water because you bear the name of Christ, truly I tell you, he will never lose his reward. So, I mean, if I may, I think that the point that we can take from that is that, people who proclaim the name of Jesus, even if they don't accompany us, even if they're not our style, even if we might disagree with them in certain respects, are still in the family, and we should be encouraging of that. So I don't think he was suggesting that as long as you don't actively hate Christianity, you are one of us. I'm afraid there is an exclusive claim that he makes that wasn't contradicted by the reference he made there. So anyway, I just wanted to push back a little bit about the suggested equivalence that you made.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I mean, lest there's any doubt on this score, I do entirely believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. I think there is something about the nature of Christian community, I think, that both has to be centered exclusively on Christ, and yet because it is centered exclusively on Christ, can afford to be fuzzy at the edges and welcoming in a precisely because it is clearly focused and on the center. And I think that I would absolutely say I think that applies to the life of the church, but I think it does have implications, I think, for how we live and engage socially as well. John, can I mean, just you in many ways you have answered my question.
Yeah, I would come in. I'll just add a couple more points to that, actually, in terms of the global sense you were talking about. And I would just say that the significance of, well, you could say all moral philosophies have an image of what humans are, right? You could talk of Hobbes, where we are living in a condition of war, or Machiavelli, where humans are selfish and it's better to be feared than loved. In contrast, the distinct religious Christian model allows you to transcend that sort of self-referential form of politics. It gives you a transcendental frame whereby human beings are created in the image of God, which is a deeper thing, which creates different moral boundaries to politics exclusively framed within those self-referential terms. That is exemplified in the story of the Good Samaritan, actually, in terms of that global humanity. And that's the point that I raised in the first point. So I accept the sort of universal global character to that. But at the same time, there are national specific. We live within bordered communities, as Danny mentioned. I don't concede to a sort of, I accept the logic of a cosmopolitan argument, but I don't accept it in terms of the management of politics, where you seek a mandate from bordered communities, which is very different to a sort of cosmopolitanism, which does operate within different political traditions. I also, just in terms of the local and the question of local agency, I come from a tradition whereby subsidiarity is a cornerstone of forms of political organisation and mobilisation. So you can operate both at the global and the local, and there's no necessary contradiction between the two.
Thank you. And I want to move on to some of the questions that have been fed through to me. I think Danny, you used the language of bad faith actors instrumentalizing Christianity. I'm going to put words in your mouth, but I think that was pretty much that. And I suggest, John, you probably wouldn't disagree with that. So what does a healthy response to bad faith actors instrumentalizing the Christian faith look like? Let's start with you, Danny.
Well, I mean, as I've said, to me, and I might just be, I might be completely wrong about this. And this is and we have a terrible threat of Christian nationalism, sort of far right people masquerading as Christians who are going to suddenly rise up and sort of start attacking us all or something. I just don't accept the premise that we have a major problem in people adopting Christian iconography in what are essentially political marches. And you know, in a sense, I honour them for doing so. They're trying to make the point that we have the foundations of this country are Christian, its institutions are, and there's real value in that. And I hope they would agree that there's value in that for everybody, not just Christians. So I think I'm fine with it. Obviously, if there is actual, evil intent, then well, we have the law and we have our culture. And the good thing about the British culture historically is that it hasn't had much time for the lunacies of the far right. I mean, I appreciate John has had to fight them, in the streets almost of East London, and they do represent a real threat in local places and at moments. But generally, our political culture has been very resistant to that because our democracy has thrown up a better alternative, which is conservatism, which is the centre right. I think, and I mean, not to get into party politics here, but I think reform is a response to that and a good one. And if we're worried about the far right, that reform is the inoculation to that. So in terms of the response, in a sense, I think allow it and disregard it for the most part, except when there is actual law breaking going on. If I may, I mean, Bishop, sorry to pick on you, but you mentioned the letter that you wrote that you signed with other church leaders after the Unite the Kingdom rally, and your suggestion to this movement is that strong condemnation of the adoption of the co-option, as you call it, of Christian symbolism. But you also suggest that, you understand, I'm just quoting from the letter, that for many of those involved in the rally, there's a deep sense of frustration at being unheard and forgotten in the democratic process.
Absolutely.
So you acknowledge, which is good. You then say we cannot heal this wound unless the church and society as a whole rises to do more to address the issues of poverty, inequality, and exclusion, implying that the reason we have this manifestation of political distress on our streets is purely one of poverty and inequality. With respect, I think you've got an essentially materialist lens. I wouldn't say a Marxist one, but it's in the same family. You have a materialist lens on what is also a cultural and ultimately spiritual phenomenon, and suggest that those people are just waving the flag because they're economically disadvantaged, I think doesn't know respect and misses the point of what they're actually saying. So I think if we're worried about people waving the flag on protests, well, we should put the flag above the Houses of Parliament more, and we should have a overtly, proudly Christian polity, and that would do for Tommy Robinson and his like. The far right disappeared. Well, UKIP disappeared. Nigel Farage disappeared when Brexit was won because the country felt it had got the politics it wanted again. Nigel arose when the Conservatives failed. And if Nigel fails now, we will have something much worse. So the way to counter this problem is to give the British people politics that they can be proud of, which includes proud Christianity. I totally agree with you that Christianity must be genuine. And this is, sorry, I'll stop talking in a second. I'm being adversarial in this conversation, but I do totally recognise the concern. And my concern about kind of cultural Christianity, people talking about Judeo-Christian traditions. I want actual Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't want it's symbolism for political purposes. I want people to, I want Christianity. And that must be the politics we have, the Christian politics that I wish we had, would be genuine, and therefore it would be as gentle and as loving and as it were sort of countercultural as you want it to be. But let's have Christianity itself, and let's not be afraid of what that stands for.
Thank you. I will just gently push back on what you said before I go to John. I think it was precisely the use of the word exclusion that in that letter that indicates that we were not simply seeing this through a socioeconomic lens, and were seeing it through a cultural one. And I think if any culture any frankly comfortable middle class liberal culture that inadvertently excludes large sections of the population is not only unjust, but is extremely risky and dangerous. So I absolutely agree. I think there's a sharp cultural point to be made there. I think there are issues of economics as well, but it isn't just about that, and it's not just about materialism. John,
I think it was me that emphasised the economics in some of this in my initial conversation, because I do see it as playing into a sense of the end of a political economy associated with the last 50 years, which has blown up mainstream politics. So there is a material basis to this in terms of patterns of poverty, inequality, lack of social mobility, housing crisis, productivity, wages that play into this sense of politics being upended, because the political parties that oversaw, advocated and upheld this tradition for the last 50 years cannot deliver anymore for the people. And I think the people want change, and reform speaks to that sense of change. But I also add, a lot of the leaders of reform were exactly the same people who ushered in this economics experiment, which is disintegrating all around us for the last 50 years. So, and they upheld it, and it's the high watermark of that revolution in the early 80s. And now we're dealing with the consequences of all that. A lot of them are trying to get out from under their own culpability and then say this is a time for a spiritual revival and disinvent the material basis that lies underneath some of this stuff. And I saw this at first hand in a community that literally was deindustrializing because of the consequences of a failed economic experiment of the last 50 years. And it was played out in anger, resentment, which bent through certain ethno-nationalist movements and very cynical movements that scavenged people's frustrations for far-right political purposes. And that's why I do think people like Danny should call out some of the language associated with the modern use of the flag, which is built around racial superiority, geographical separation, and exclusive politics of ethno-nationalism. And it's incumbent, I think, for reform, if they are real, they should have a much more muscular rejection of what we can see and detect in some of the organisers of the movements in local levels, like in Dagenham recently. And I think we should have a much more stronger response. I mean, to say that we all love the flag is not good enough to me, because this is being very cynically appropriated by extremist forces to tear the country apart. And it's incumbent on all of us to step up to that. And that's why I welcomed the letter, actually, Bishop Philip and colleagues put out, because I thought there was a real political vacuum. And I include the Labour Party leadership in this, in the aftermath of the Tommy Robinson battle, where you saw literally crosses at the centre of that rally to signify it was a religious movement that was being developed. I saw it more of a nationalist movement that is ramping up violence and trying to destroy a sense of community solidarity, especially in the poorest of communities in Britain. And I do think it needs to be called out, most importantly, by those parties such as Reform, who claim to be challenging the economic orthodoxies of the last 50 years.
I want to come to some of the questions on the screen, but Danny, do you just want to respond to John briefly?
Well, there's loads in there. I mean, I have a huge respect for John, and you know, as he knows, and we've talked about this over the years, you know, I share a lot of his analysis of the effects of the deindustrialization and the way that the retreat from the industrial era left communities hollowed out, and the assumption that the way the Industrial Revolution had begun, with capital and labour finding each other through the natural process of the market, would also ensure that the post-industrial era was prosperous. You know, that assumption was totally wrong. You know, people didn't, the money didn't flow into these poor areas, and the labour didn't flow out to where there was work. You just had bereft places and bereft people across our country, and he's absolutely right that the economic model of our lifetimes has been one of increasing inequality, and so I share the materialist explanation of why we have social and political disarray. My point was more immediately that I do think there is meaning in the use of religious and spiritual symbols by people who are protesting against the state we're in, and we shouldn't overlook that. So, to what extent? I mean, John is challenging me to condemn the Unite the Kingdom rally. I think it's a too complicated a concept. I can't condemn it overall. I certainly recognise that there would have been very unsavoury aspects to it. There would definitely have been racists among in that march. But there also would have been very good people who would have listened to every word that was spoken from the front and agreed with it. And I think so I don't think the problem we have is that rally or that movement. The problem we have is what's causing it, and that is partly material and economic, and it's partly cultural and spiritual. And if we want to see the back of, we don't want protests like that. Frankly, the people on them don't want protests like that. They didn't want to come out and do that stuff, make a noise. If we want to see peace in our streets and in our society and in our culture, I think we need to address the root causes of it, which is a economic and also a spiritual malaise. And I suspect that John and I would find quite a lot to agree with in what the rest of the prescription for that would be. It'd be a politics. I mean, it'd be a very blue Labour politics that reform shares, and of family, community, and country. Those are the three words that my party promotes. I recognise John's challenge. He's not wrong to, he's mischievously pointing out that many of the reform leaders, including Nigel, were in the 80s Thatcherites and free marketeers. Well, so they should have been, because in the 80s, the great challenge was our economic sclerosis. What should have been done better in the post-Thatcher era was a better policy of deindustrialization, which should have been done better under the heirs to Thatcher, Major, Blair, Cameron. So I think it's a fair challenge, but it's also true to say, just as Thatcher herself was also a Christian and a communitarian, she had her blue Labour aspects too. So did Nigel throughout. And I think, I mean, just to conclude, my conservatism comprehends the tension that's within each of us between freedom and belonging, between the desire for sort of entrepreneurial independence with the desire for stability, community, tradition. And I think in Nigel, having moved from an emphasis on freedom and entrepreneurialism to one of family, community, and nation is an appropriate response to the challenges of our time. It's not a contradiction.
I thought it was very well put. And it wasn't personal, by the way, in terms of your own personal culpability of what the last 50 years.
Can I ask you, and I'm kind of setting myself up here slightly, but what would you say is the role of the church, and in particular the Church of England in developing a positive sense of national identity at this particular time? You talked, John, in language, I'm quite sure that Danny wouldn't disagree with you about needing national vision and spiritual rearmament. So what would you be looking for the church and, members of the church who will be on this webinar? What would you be looking to us to do? What's our distinctive role?
I'm interested increasingly in the history of how pioneering social movements were grounded in religious traditions, right?
Yeah, sure.
And you can go back to, I don't know, abolitionism, Quakerism, and the role of Anglican and evangelical forces, Quakers, the Factory Acts. You can go back to the late 19th century religion of socialism, the prehistory of the Labour Party. You can go through the sort of early social reformers, Edwardian liberalism to challenge the indignities central to capitalism of the time. You could even argue that the post-war advance of economic and social rights, human rights, was a response to tyranny, authoritarianism, fascism. At these historic turning points, religious movements have moved into the public domain to advance what I would call as a human-based reanimation of politics, to challenge the indignities of the day. And that is your role. It's incumbent on you to do so today. And that's why I am so angry about some of this. geographical separatism and racial intolerance, because I can see where it'll go, and it will breed violence, and we need to step up and resist these forces. Now I know reform's on a bit of a high wire here because it sees itself as the antidote to those forces, and if it fails, they're fearful of what comes next. I accept that, but I think part of the responsibility of that is to take more of a responsibility to call out what's happening with the modern appropriation of these different religious traditions. And I think we need a national conversation within all our denominations about how we feed into a sense of spiritual renaissance in this country, actually, and confront some of the material issues as well as the spiritual shortfalls that have created a wider sense of unease across our nations.
Thank you. Danny.
Yeah, I mean, that very, very well put by John. I think if we can listen, we're in a fallen world, and it would be a dangerous thing if we all had a perfect vision for the New Jerusalem.
Sure.
And so, the value of a pluralistic politics, which I think derives from Christianity and the recognition of the seculum, the period between while we wait for the second coming, in which we have to sort of organize ourselves in the here and now, with reference to political disputes about property and the correct ordering of the economy. We've got to have this out publicly, democratically. The glory of as I keep, love to remind everybody that the House of Commons is a chapel. We can debate in there like the Putney Puritans did. Let's discuss the proper ordering. And John's economics, are probably more not statist, but they're more communitarian than mine. But that's fine. And I think if we can all, as it were, contest for the label of the most scripturally orthodox economics. I mean, we shouldn't make all our base all our policy suggestions on the Bible, but it's not a bad place to start. And
certainly isn't.
And I think what John's saying about articulating a sort of a genuine humanism in the original sense of the term being about understanding how human beings have to operate in this world, and having a real interest in and placing value on reason and on individual personal dignity. I think that would be a far richer political debate than one that roots itself in these incredibly shallow metaphysics around equality and liberty and these sort of meaningless terms when you don't have if you've sacrificed the roots that they were planted in, that they grew out of.
Yeah, quite.
So I mean, this is the sort of politics we should be having, this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I sense, I think perhaps particularly in you, John, some real anxiety about the future, about where we're heading. I mean, I think one of the theories about the Quiet Revival that I find quite convincing. Well, two. One is that this is the young people who are finding Christian faith for themselves are not, than perhaps the first generation who don't have the hang-ups of their indeed the prejudices of the anti-Christian prejudices of their parents and their grandparents. But also, this is the first generation that perhaps really doesn't think the future is going to be better than the past. So looking for hope and meaning in the Christian faith is a very natural thing to do. But do you both still think that there is a role for traditional politics and traditional institutions in finding a solution to these issues, or do we really need to see something quite different break out of all of this? Are we sort of fixed into polarization and echo chambers by our politics, or do our politics have some hope for us? John, I think it's probably principally a question for you. I think Danny's more hopeful for the chapel of the House of I'm
hopeful, but not that optimistic about it, in the sense that I have a sense of foreboding about what lies ahead, because I think the mainstream political parties appear ill-equipped. They lack the self-awareness and the intellectual resources to get out from under their own culpability in this process of decline. They cannot. They're so utilitarian in their approach to the management of the economy, which is premised on a growth that's not coming back soon, that they've got little to run on apart from that. They can't excavate their own political traditions to rebuild a public philosophy commensurate with the challenges of our time, which is what they need to do. Consequently, other political forces are moving in, not just reform, but some of the political appropriation of religions is filling this gap. I would like to think that the centre-left have a proud, rich history that can be a resource in that process of reanimation and a renewed political philosophy, part of this spiritual renaissance, to confront what is driving this. And primarily, I would also add the role of technology. And I think that is helping to drive younger people towards different belief systems and religions, because they see it's destroying their lives, And meanwhile, utilitarian politicians see it as a silver bullet for a growth model and are ignoring the consequential effects in terms of the lives that people are living. And we should be indignant about that and be mobilizing around it, because it threatens the integrity of the human condition. So there's no bigger challenge than that. That should be able to repurpose our political traditions, given the centrality, the significance of that challenge. But it doesn't look like it is, I'm afraid. Indeed, we seem captive to those technologies and the perpetrators of it globally.
Interestingly, I was talking to someone who seems to be a sort of global leader in AI, and he was suggesting actually that increasingly young people are spending less time on their devices,
right,
and reaching for the analog, and maybe that's part of the whole quiet revival thing as well. And if so, I think we should celebrate that. Danny, do you want to pick up on that about are our traditional politics and institutions redeemable? Are they part of the solution to all of this?
Yes, well, I mean, as you say, I do have confidence. I mean, well, I have hope in the structures we've got. I mean, I obviously joined a party that has a kind of radical plan to restore the basis of our parliamentary government, parliamentary democracy. Our objection is that we feel that too much power has been delegated and handed over to unaccountable institutions. So, we've got plans for big change, but they are restorative rather than revolutionary. And I don't think we can do better than representative democracy. We also need strong civil society. I mean, it's a very thin concept of democracy that thinks that you just, vote every 4 or 5 years and hand it over to 650 people, and that's that. We need active citizenship, and we need a better model of local decision making. And I think there's huge opportunities there, partly enabled through technology, but partly explicitly anti-technological. I mean, I think we're also entering an age when that feels like an older politics. I mean, increasingly, you won't trust what you see on a screen, and you'll want to see people in face to face. And again, I think the paradox is that the politicians that are most successful at the moment are ones that can actually talk to a great crowd. I mean, they might be good online too, but they are actually old-fashioned, Gladstonian, crowd pleasers. So that's what populism, I think, looks like. But the model of parliamentary democracy in which we send people to have a civilized conversation in the same physical space, and treat each other well, even if they might argue quite passionately in the chamber, they all then queue for coffee in the tea room.
Exactly.
That feels like very good politics to me.
Yeah. I think my only the only thing I'd want to add to what you said is you talk a lot about the House of Commons. You haven't mentioned the House of Lords, which I feel is perhaps something missing in your discourse, Danny. But I take your general point. And I think just a closing comment from me. You mentioned the Putney debates, and of course the Putney debates were an attempt to formulate a new politics, and essentially they failed. And the story of the English Revolution is that actually we couldn't do without our traditional institutions. But I think part of our genius has been to reinvent those traditional institutions so that they are fit for purpose for the time in which we live, and in a way that I hope is faithful to their roots, which, as you've both acknowledged, are profoundly Christian ones. So thank you very much, both of you, for your rich contributions this evening, and thank you to everyone who has joined us online. God bless you.